Imagine a palace filled with secrets, a family bound by tradition, and a quiet war being fought behind closed doors. For years, one woman has been quietly pulling the strings, reshaping the monarchy to fit her vision. But now her plan has been exposed, and the one person who uncovered it is the last person anyone expected. This is a story about power, betrayal, and a queen who tried to rewrite the future. It started with a memo, a document so explosive that it threatened to tear the royal family apart. Camilla's camp allegedly wrote up an actual plan about restructuring the monarchy to bypass Prince William, and the only reason we even know about it is because Princess Anne decided she was done being quiet. What is wild to me is that Anne did not hold a press conference. She did not release a statement through official palace channels with the little royal crest at the top. It was a leaked communication, deliberate and direct, and everyone who knows how Anne operates understood immediately that this was not a slip. Princess Anne has spent decades being the one royal who never courted controversy. She never gave the tabloids anything to work with. She never even seemed interested in being liked. She just showed up, did the engagements, and went home. So when she breaks ranks, it lands differently than if it came from someone who is always in the headlines. The message referenced what she called a coordinated attempt to disrupt the line of succession. And while she did not drop Camilla's name outright, the phrasing was so pointed that nobody had to ask who she meant. She wrote that actions had been taken that violate the late Queen's expressed wishes and threaten the future of this institution. Invoking Queen Elizabeth's expressed wishes is basically the nuclear option in royal terms. That is not a casual disagreement about scheduling. That is Anne positioning herself as the guardian of her mother's legacy and saying out loud that someone inside the palace is actively working against it. So let us talk about what Anne actually uncovered, because the details that have surfaced since that initial leak are honestly more damning than the accusation itself. According to sources close to the princess, she spent months in this state of inner conflict, finding things she was not supposed to see, piecing together a pattern that she initially tried to dismiss as palace reshuffling. Anne and William have always been close. She sees him as the monarchy's last unshakable pillar. Her words apparently not just Diana's son, but the kind of future monarch the crown desperately needs. Though when Camilla's influence over Charles started deepening, and Anne felt herself being pushed further from the center of decision-making, she noticed conversations that used to happen in her presence started happening behind closed doors. Invitations that used to be extended to her went elsewhere. She told herself it was just evolving roles, modernizing, the usual palace vocabulary for things nobody wants to explain. But then she found the communication she was never meant to see. Buried in restricted documents were references to succession reform, names redacted, language polished to the point of being almost unreadable, but the implications were clear. The agenda was to weaken William's pathway to the throne under the guise of modernization, and I think that is the part that makes this so insidious. Honestly, nobody wrote down, "We are removing Prince William from the line of succession." That would be too obvious, too easy to leak, and too hard to spin. Instead, the language was all about reconsideration of succession dynamics, modernized ceremonial roles, and reallocation of representational duties. It is the kind of phrasing that sounds boring and bureaucratic until you actually read it line by line and realize every single recommendation points towards slowly eroding William's visibility, his influence, and ultimately his position. The final paragraph of the memo allegedly recommended fast-tracking these measures before public expectations fully solidify around the Cambridge legacy. That is not governance. That is a timeline for a coup dressed up in committee language. When Anne found this, aides described her as unusually withdrawn for weeks, haunted, not angry. In private writings that surfaced later, she described the palace as rotting from within and spoke of a quiet conspiracy wrapped in protocol. Those are not the words of someone who is overreacting to office politics. Those are the words of someone who has just realized the institution she defended her entire life is turning on its own bloodline. She started confiding in William, but carefully. Late-night meetings without staff. Old-fashioned handwritten notes instead of anything traceable. She did not want to alarm him, but she needed him to know that something was structurally wrong. William, being William, urged caution. He has always been the diplomat, always trying to keep things from exploding. But Anne saw what he could not, or maybe what he did not want to see, which is that Camilla was not just playing politics. She was engineering a new monarchy that did not include him. Now, the thing about Camilla's rise that makes this whole situation more complicated than just a family feud is how methodical it has been. This did not start with a memo. Long before the world saw her crowned beside King Charles, there were whispers about a calculated ascent. After Diana's death, there was always this subtle coldness between William and Camilla. On the surface, they maintained civility, but insiders have talked for years about brief looks, stiff conversations, calculated absences that hinted at something unresolved. William was fiercely protective of his mother's legacy, and Camilla, according to people close to the palace, never forgot the way Diana's memory clung to the crown like a shadow she could not erase. But Camilla was not sitting around being haunted by Diana. She was building. As Queen Elizabeth's health declined and Charles's responsibilities grew heavier, Camilla stepped into the void not just as a consort but as a strategist. Royal watchers noticed her influence expanding. She was not just accompanying Charles anymore. She was co-steering the ship. Key advisors shifted. Familiar faces vanished. In their place came loyalist figures who owed their positions not to tradition but to Camilla. A whole court was forming behind the scenes. A network of aides and press secretaries and private counselors circling the throne not around Charles but around her. These were not loud appointments. They were surgical insertions, always framed as necessary modernizations or part of streamlining royal affairs. But people with long memories knew better. The monarchy is traditionally cautious. It does not move swiftly unless someone is pulling strings. And then Charles had his moments of weakness, periods of illness, stress, emotional vulnerability, and those became windows of opportunity. People who once had direct access to the king found themselves rerouted. Requests got filtered, appearances got curated. Camilla was often beside Charles during these fragile times, and allegedly she ensured that only certain voices reached him. Voices that favored her vision of a streamlined, media-savvy monarchy, one that did not necessarily require William at its center. So when the memo finally leaked, it was not some shocking departure from everything Camilla had been doing. It was the logical endpoint of years of quiet maneuvering. The document was clinical in tone, bureaucratic in structure, but the intent was unmistakable. And when it reached William's inner circle, the reaction was instant. One senior aide reportedly stormed out of the room. Another was in tears. The words betrayal and treason were being shouted, not whispered. For William, it was confirmation that the cold stares and the quiet exclusions and the subtle shifts were not paranoia. They were precision strikes. Journalists traced the leak through digital fingerprints to a cluster of senior advisors who had all in recent years been seen as unusually close to Camilla's inner circle. Not fringe figures, not low-level staff, but people at the heart of palace operations. Trusted voices turned instruments of a shadow agenda. Camilla's office refused to comment, but the connections were too precise to be coincidence. And outside the palace gates, the public response was swift. Justice for William and Camilla coup trended globally. Polls showed a sharp shift in public sympathy, with people demanding transparency about the succession and the queen consort's role behind the scenes. For an institution so carefully crafted around image and tradition, this was not just a scandal, it was a rupture. But here is where it gets really strange. Days passed and the palace said nothing. No statement, no denial, no clarification. The firm, which is usually so swift with damage control, just stood frozen. Some people speculated the silence was a strategy, trying to suffocate the firestorm by denying it oxygen. Others believed the institution was caught off guard and simply did not know how to contain the truth once it had been let loose. But the question that kept echoing was simpler than all the strategy talk. If such a document existed, who allowed it to be written, who authorized the language, who approved the plan, and who benefited from it? King Charles's silence during all of this has been maybe the loudest part of the whole crisis. He said nothing in public, nothing even to his son apparently. And to understand why, you have to understand the man behind the crown. Throughout his life, Charles has been accused of wavering, delaying hard decisions, avoiding confrontation. Now, in the center of the most explosive royal crisis in decades, that trait has resurfaced. While the public demands clarity and the family fractures behind palace doors, Charles retreats inward, leaving the nation and his son in limbo. But according to people close to the king, it is not just personal indecision. Camilla now exerts a firm grip on his schedule, his messaging, even his private time. Meetings are filtered through her gatekeepers. Correspondence gets screened. Insiders claim Charles rarely takes calls without Camilla present in the room. It is no longer just a partnership. It is a presidency in all but name. A monarchy silently redirected under the influence of a queen consort whose ambitions may have always stretched beyond support. Then came the whispers about private conversations between Charles and constitutional reform advisors. These were not ceremonial consultations. They were confidential, off-record, deliberately undocumented. The topic was streamlining the monarchy, simplifying succession, modernizing representation. All noble in name, but when you examine them in context, they trace too closely to the language found in the leaked memo, too closely to be coincidence, and still Charles said nothing. Even when Anne brought the evidence to him directly, sources described that meeting between brother and sister as cold, brutal, and final. Anne, steely and unwavering, demanded answers. She spoke not as a sibling, but as a sentinel of their mother's legacy. Charles, reportedly pale and withdrawn, refused to confirm or deny anything. But the silence that followed was so sharp and so hollow that it confirmed what words never could. The damage was not just personal at that point. It was constitutional. Palace staff began to splinter. Some aligned with William and Anne, others loyal to Charles and Camilla dug in. Rumors surfaced of a royal ultimatum, an internal call to force the king's hand to speak, to choose, to restore order before the crown shattered under the weight of its own secrets. And yet the king remained quiet, maybe out of fear, maybe out of guilt, or maybe because the truth would destroy more than just the monarchy's public image. It would destroy the man himself. Charles stayed silent. Camilla's camp went into full media offensive mode. Within hours of Anne's revelation, there was a wave of carefully packaged messaging. Journalists got invited to cozy off-record chats. Long-standing royal correspondents suddenly had access again. Headlines started appearing that seemed too coordinated to be coincidence, all pushing the same phrases about Camilla's quiet grace amid palace turmoil. A steady queen in unsteady times. The intent was surgical: reframe the narrative, recast the roles, and most importantly, discredit Anne. Anonymous briefings began slipping into the press, portraying Anne as emotionally unstable, too close to William, too bitter about her place in the hierarchy. Words like fragile and resentful and isolated started appearing in royal coverage, all aimed at undercutting Anne's credibility without directly naming her. Even her long-standing loyalty to the late queen was questioned, with whispers suggesting personal grudges were behind her decision to speak out. Then came the pundits. TV panels filled with royal analysts who just weeks earlier had offered measured praise for Anne's dedication were now labeling her actions reckless, divisive, and ill-timed. But the most calculated tactic was how they spun the leaked memo, not as a coup but as a misunderstood proposal for reform. A modernization plan misinterpreted by traditionalists. That phrase caught on and got repeated until it started to feel like fact. Behind the curtain, the moves turned darker. Staff members known to be sympathetic to Anne and William reported subtle forms of pressure. Schedules disrupted, travel denied, even veiled threats about contract renewals. Whistleblowers found their phones monitored, their families targeted by gossip. And perhaps most disturbing of all, reports emerged that Camilla's team had attempted to gain access to Anne's private correspondences. Messages between her and William, her journal entries. Any scrap that could be weaponized. But Camilla underestimated something. The palace was not as united behind her as she believed. In the chaos, a new voice began to stir. A royal figure who had remained publicly neutral until now reached out to Anne. That alliance sent shock waves through the inner circle. The lines were redrawn. Quiet allegiances became public stands. And for Camilla, who had worked for decades to silence the past and shape the future, the resistance was now coming from within. And then the aide came forward. This is the part of the story that honestly changes everything, because up until this point it was Anne's word against Camilla's spin machine. But a senior royal aide, someone deeply embedded and long trusted and once fiercely protective of the institution, decided she could no longer live with the silence. Her name remains hidden for now, but her testimony expands Anne's story in ways that make it impossible to dismiss. According to her, the memo that shook the monarchy was not a sudden creation. It was the result of months, possibly years of quiet drafting, revision, and back-channel discussion. Early versions were bolder. They did not hide their objective behind coded phrases. The intention was direct: remove William from the line of succession under the guise of constitutional modernization. The only reason the language changed was fear. Fear that it would leak before Camilla had secured enough control to contain the fallout. And this is the detail that stopped me cold. When I first read it, Charles saw it. He read it. He discussed it not once but on multiple occasions. The aide remembers delivering briefing folders, heavily redacted, yes, but never truly hidden. The king may not have authored the strategy, but he allowed its survival. He allowed its refinement. And when the final version reached his desk, he raised no objection. He did not sign it, but he did not stop it either. If that is true, then the entire narrative about Charles being manipulated or unaware completely falls apart. You cannot be manipulated into something you have read and discussed multiple times over months. The aide also recounted something she overheard Camilla say to a private confidant. She did not catch every word, but the line she remembered was impossible to forget. This will end the Diana chapter for good. That is not about legacy. That is about erasure. That is about severing the bloodline that Diana left behind. Aide tried to leave quietly after that. She requested reassignment, citing health concern. Instead, she was watched. Phone calls intercepted. Friends warned to stay away. One evening, she came home to find her front door unlocked. Nothing was taken, but everything had been moved. Subtle enough to deny, chilling enough to send a message that compliance was not optional. And still she kept records, copies, notes, dates, her own little archive, because one day she feared she might need to protect herself. That day has come. She has spoken to Anne's team, provided documentation, and made a promise that if Anne takes this public, she will testify. When she talks about the cost, her voice cracks. The sleepless nights, the guilt, the moment she saw William in the corridor and could not meet his eyes. I believed in the institution, she said, until the institution became something else. So now the world waits, because the next move does not belong to Camilla or even Charles. It belongs to Anne. She has held the line for family and for country. But she's stepping into the light now, not as a quiet royal, but as the monarchy's last defender. She knows this is no longer about reputation. It is about survival, not of her own position, but of the monarchy's integrity. For weeks she has watched the institution falter, corroded from within by silence and manipulation and deceit. Now armed with testimony and documents and a public mandate, she is making her boldest move yet. She is calling for an independent royal tribunal, one with the power to investigate and question and expose the interference in the line of succession. For the first time in modern history, the monarchy would have to answer to its own shadow. Behind closed doors, support is building. Quiet nods from across the Commonwealth. Senior advisors in Canada and Australia and former Crown allies are beginning to speak in whispers of concern. Anne's private calls, once brushed off as ceremonial courtesy, now carry weight. She is no longer acting alone. She's becoming the nucleus of a constitutional reckoning. William, though shaken, stands behind her, not as a son, not even as a prince, but as a man who has endured the slow erosion of trust and lineage. He knows what this tribunal will uncover because he has lived it. He urges caution, hoping to avoid a total implosion of the monarchy. But Anne is resolute. There is no future without accountability, no throne worth inheriting if it is built on quiet betrayal. Camilla's once confident circle is fracturing. Her media machine is slowing. Interviews are getting cancelled. Appearances are being postponed. Staff resignations are leaking to the press. Sources describe her as melting down behind palace walls. The woman once so adept at navigating shadows now finds herself paralyzed by exposure. The illusion is crumbling, and with it her grip on the crown. And at the very center, King Charles wavers. Reports are emerging that close confidants have urged him to consider the unthinkable. Abdication, not as punishment but as preservation. Step aside, they suggest. Let William take the throne while the monarchy still has breath left in its lungs. For Charles, the man who waited a lifetime to reign, it is a shattering proposition. But the calls are growing louder internally and from the public. Outside the palace, a movement is erupting. Protect the throne. Team William. Justice for Anne. What was once a family matter is now a global reckoning. People are choosing sides, and for the first time the royal family can no longer hide behind protocol. The people are demanding transparency and accountability. Anne does not seek the throne, she never has, but what she seeks now is bigger than titles. It is truth, and if that truth destroys everything the monarchy once stood on, then so be it. Because for her there is no honor in silence and no future without fire. The world has seen royal scandals before, but nothing like this. And as the battle lines are drawn, only one truth remains. The future of the crown hangs by a thread.